Hello there. Today I want to talk about an organization that we believe is using its influence to provide unqualified and misleading information that is endangering lives. You may be surprised by the identity of this organization, as they are usually associated with saving lives rather than risking them. The organisation I am referring to is the Western Australian arm of St John Ambulance. After the tragic death of a 22-month-old boy, Zaza, in his father's arms in Joondalup, Western Australia, many councils, including Joondalup, have decided to install the TGA-reviewed and listed LifeVac airway clearance device at their facilities for choking emergencies when first aid fails. Some of these councils have reached out to St John seeking independent and expert advice. Instead, what they received was a lot of unevidenced nonsense and speculation. This advice had no supporting evidence, no cited extracts of any legislation or legal documentation to support their claims. While I am sure that St John Western Australia do a great deal of good for the community in health and emergency services, in this matter, they have based their advice simply on unevidenced rhetoric and speculation about matters they obviously have little knowledge. We don't really understand the motivation for this misinformation campaign, but we suspect a false perception of a threat to their training financial income mixed with a loyalty to another group that spreads this type of unevidenced historical and inaccurate nonsense, the Australian Resuscitation Council. So, today, we will attempt to clear up some of this misinformation and falsity to set the record straight. We have repeatedly requested the evidence, legislation and law that should underpin their advice, but they have refused to produce it to us, or in fact to any organisation that has requested advice from them on this matter. The first thing to remember is that St John has no legislated authority for first aid practice, nor does it have any jurisdiction outside its own organisation. Secondly, the Australian Resuscitation Council is not a legislated regulator of first aid practice in Australia, nor is it responsible for the endorsement or approval of first aid measures or medical devices. There is also no legal requirement that prohibits first aid practice or protection under law from sticking strictly to a set of unenforceable, consensus opinion-based guidelines. This is a myth spread by these organisations to appear that they have some authority. In Australian law in an emergency, the only threshold for liability is proven recklessness. Using a device reviewed and listed by the only legislated regulator, the TGA, after first aid fails, cannot be deemed as reckless. To suggest so is simply disingenuous. It is of no legal, legislative or practical importance whether the LifeVac is internally recommended, approved or endorsed by St John or the ARC, as the only legislated regulator is the TGA. There is also no requirement for the LifeVac to be specifically mentioned in the Work Health and Safety Workplace First Aid Code of Practice, nor the ANZCOR training units of competency to be used in Australia or taught. These two assertions are also false and are not supported by any legislation or act. SafeWork has formally advised that there is no requirement for the specific mention of any medical device, including the LifeVac, in the Code of Practice to enable its use, and the code actually encourages additional equipment and training to manage identified risks. It further advised that anyone suggesting this was providing advice that was contrary to the Act. There is also no requirement for the LifeVac to be in the ANZCOR units of competency to be taught or used in Australia. There is again no legislation that supports this notion. While St John strictly adheres to its own training, strictly following the minimum standards of the units of competency, this is because they believe that the sky will fall in if they don't, and bodies will pile up in the streets. There is no basis in legislation, law or scientific evidence to support these assertions. The next false claim spread by St John Western Australia and the ARC is that the LifeVac may cause harm in its operation and further harm by delaying first aid measures. Considering that these false claims have already been considered by the TGA, the national regulator, during its review and found to have no basis in evidence. In fact, the TGA concluded that the motivations of the ARC in raising these unevidenced speculations were not in the best interests of the health and welfare of Australians, but likely motivated by other interests. If there was harm associated with the operation of the LifeVac, considering it is monitored, unlike first aid, for harm and failure by regulators around the world, the TGA would like to know about this evidence. No such evidence exists, and independent, peer-reviewed, published case series reviews of the documented case reports have shown no evidence of this. This is speculative fear-mongering. The same studies showed no hypothesized delay that resulted in harm. Again, speculative nonsense that has no basis in evidence. The final false statements being made by these organizations are that there is insufficient evidence to recommend the LifeVac and that strong evidence is required. Considering that the ARC is not a research body and has not considered any scientific literature on the LifeVac in the past 5 years, one would suspect that this advice is not only outdated but very flimsy. No first aid measure for choking has strong evidence, and some, like ANZCOR, chest thrusts, have no clinical evidence or any rationale, but are promoted as safe and effective. This has been established by international peer-reviewed research. Why then does LifeVac need strong evidence if it is not seeking to replace a poorly evidenced first aid measure? This is illogical. No randomized control trial has or can ever be conducted on a first aid measure to prove efficacy and safety. Therefore, any call for an RCT for LifeVac as a condition for acceptance is a complete logical fallacy. LifeVac has saved thousands of lives around the world, including in Australia, all after first aid has failed, no harm, no delay, and no failure, multiple peer-reviewed studies, and device regulator data. While it may be hard for these organizations to accept the weaknesses in their evidence, arguments, and logic, it is quite appalling that they would accept anything else for the basis of the opinions they provide to others and put lives at risk for socio-political purposes. Of course, we have seen other similar organizations repeat these falsehoods, but few have gone out of their way to interfere with the decisions of others. We are happy to debate in any forum with these organizations. However, so far they have refused to do so and prefer more subversive means. There is a truism that says that an appeal to authority becomes a fallacy when it's used as the sole or primary reason for accepting a claim, especially if the authority figure is not actually an expert on the subject, they have not reviewed the evidence, or if there's disagreement among experts on the topic. Simply put, the argument X is true because an authority figure said so is weak if there's no other evidence to support X. The central illogical assertion by these organizations is that by some self-decree, they have more authority than the TGA, the Department of Health, and the Health Minister, who have all been involved in reviewing all their assertions and listing the LifeVac without restriction in Australia. While claiming there is a lack of studies that are not biased, these organizations fail to inform others that in fact all studies have a potential for bias. This is inherent in research. However, that does not mean there is bias in the data that means it cannot be trusted. This is a misunderstanding of evidence review methodology by those who don't understand it, or want to deliberately mislead others. Medical devices are governed by law in reporting and not anecdotal stories like first aid. If the evidence exists that the data is false and cannot be trusted because of bias, then please forward it to the medical device regulators. Otherwise, we suggest that these organizations stop making this spurious allegation. This would be akin to deciding not to take any pharmaceutical drugs because all drug trials are sponsored by drug companies and therefore invalid. This is extremely and deliberately poor logic, simple ineptitude or malice. Additionally, a financial interest does not disqualify data that is presented in studies or independently held by regulators. Both these organizations, despite their protestations and assurances, have positions that are contrary to the current neutral position of the International Liaison Committee on Resuscitation, LifeCOR, an organization they have sworn their undying allegiance to as the sovereign source of all knowledge. This is not because they are smarter or better at research. It is because they are able to elevate their opinions to guidelines over evidence. Of course, Some will question why it is necessary to convey these facts at this time and if we are concerned about defamation. Firstly, the need for setting the record straight is that lives are and will be lost based on very poor, unevidenced and biased advice, and others who in the past have trusted these organisations for accurate advice based on evidence are being misled for what we believe are purely socio-political purposes. In regard to defamation, well, yes and no. Under Australian law, defamation defences include public interest and truth. As we can prove the material published is in the public interest, i.e. their safety and welfare, and is substantially true, then we can rely on the truth defence. We are able to prove the implication to be true in substance or not materially different from the truth, even if it appears defamatory. We do know, however, that these organisations seem to be very vindictive toward anyone who calls them out. However, as neither of the organisation has provided any evidence, legal or legislative proof of their assumptions and advice and refuse to debate the evidence, we consider this has demonstrated the provable falsity of their positions. The last falsity spread by these organisations is that there is a lack of unbiased studies supporting the safety and use of the LifeVac. As we, unlike either of these organisations, have actually reviewed all studies mentioning LifeVac in the past 5 years to identify bias, we did find bias. However, it is actually bias against LifeVac that is not supported by the data and evidence considered in the studies, but an opinion inserted into the conclusions to support a historical narrative. 88% of these studies supported LifeVac in the data and evidence, but only 55% supported LifeVac in the conclusions and predominantly based these on biased speculations and the reliance on previous unevidenced conclusions of other authors. We suggest that any organisation or individual considering the LifeVac should not simply accept a hollow appeal to authority, but demand the evidence to support any advice against the use of the LifeVac. Thank you for listening.